Morning everyone. I gather that John has very kindly explained that I missed my flight this morning. Thanks John. I thought I'd better explain what happened. I'm fortunate enough to do these sort of talks around the country pretty often, and over the years I've tried a lot of different ways to try and get myself in the zone for doing these presentations, get myself fired up, get my game face on. Sometimes I'd sort of do a bit of exercise, do a few push-ups and star jumps. Sometimes go for a bit of a walk and enjoy the fresh air. Sometimes I might do a bit of meditation and mindfulness to ground myself. This morning I thought I'd try something different because I knew it was a big conference, an exciting one. So I had a 7 o'clock flight. I woke up at 6:25 and I thought, hey, let's see if we can beat the land world speed record for going between Karori and Wellington Airport. It turns out that the wiggles around Kelburn and the 7,000 sets of lights going through the centre of Wellington CBD prevented that, but I was pretty close. Didn't quite make it, sadly. But I did get on the next flight, so thanks for your patience. I know you've been dying to hear from an economist all morning, so I do appreciate that. On an entirely unrelated note, if you hear my phone go off this afternoon at 5:30 p.m. and it sounds like an alarm clock, you might have an understanding of why I woke up a little bit late. Right, so I'm here today to briefly talk you through a study which we haven't yet started, but this is what we're going to be looking at, and I'll talk you briefly through what we're going to try and do and why, and the limits of that analysis. It came about as a result of the really effective discussions that John Tanner and others have had with officials and ministers over the last couple of years, outlining your concerns about the availability of logs in New Zealand and how that might be being affected by other countries' policy settings. So this work is being funded by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. We haven't quite signed the contract, but we should be doing that in the next week or two. Just by way of background, Sense Partners is a boutique economic consultancy in Wellington and Auckland. There's just the 5 of us, so I joined in February and became the 5th Sense. It's pretty busy at the moment. We've thought about bringing in another partner, but when it comes to appointing a 6th Sense, there's just something telling me it's not quite right. Many of you will recognise Shamabil Yaqub. He has a view on absolutely everything. And if you're wondering, the guy in the middle is not actually related to Robert Muldoon. We have checked his lineage and he is not a Muldoon, but that's my team. So the picture that we were told about is that there's a lack of domestic log supply, and that's having an impact on the extent to which processors might want to invest in New Zealand, expand their operations. If they're not getting the raw supply of logs, it's pretty challenging to make a good business case for investment. That's potentially hampering your export capacity and your productivity growth. So it's a pretty ever-changing environment. I know from previous work I've done for the WPMA that this is an industry which is very flexible. It is very adaptive, and it's made a lot of very positive investments over the past few years to stay competitive. But this is a particular issue you're facing at the moment, and we've been brought in to crunch the numbers and find out just how important it is. So what we do know is that the global market for logs and timber faces a lot of NTMs or non-tariff measures already. This chart just shows for a selection of countries the count of non-tariff measures that are in place that have been notified to the World Trade Organization. You can see New Zealand in there. It's got a couple of non-tariff measures, and these are mainly around restrictions on the export of certain indigenous species that we don't want to cut down and sell offshore. So look, there's clear evidence that there's plenty of trade policy measures in place around the world that might be affecting the supply of logs and timber. The problem with this chart is that it doesn't tell you how serious, how significant, how material any of these non-tariff measures are. It's just a plain count. Some of them might be highly distortive, others not so much. So it doesn't really tell you a lot in and of itself. We often hear about tariff escalation as well, which is, of course, a piece of jargon, but I will try and explain it. That's just referring to the fact that many countries impose tariffs on manufactured imports that are much higher than the tariffs on raw exports, raw products. So along the bottom is the applied tariffs on logs from a number of WTO members, and up the vertical axis is the applied tariffs on lumber. And you can see tariff escalation is there. Most of the tariffs are higher on lumber than they are on logs. So that's clearly an indication that our overseas markets make it harder to import processed wood than it does raw logs. So that's starting to add to the challenges that you might be starting to face. And as a consequence, I'm sure you've seen this sort of data before. This is New Zealand's exports to the world of various products, logs, lumber, and everything else in that particular harmonised system code. And it's a pretty clear divergence, really. We can see what's happening. Logs are going out, processed wood and lumber not so much, hasn't shown a great degree of growth, despite all starting at around the same level in 1988. So again, there's an indication that there's something going on in these markets which is preventing New Zealand from exporting a huge amount of processed wood. So we want to get a sense of how do some of these trade distortions that we've just talked about, so the non-tariff measures, and that can include subsidies, and the tariffs, other policies, what impact are they having on New Zealand's exports? And the way we do this is by a fairly simple conceptual comparison between what we export already, which is the green line, and what we would expect to export if we think about the things that drive exports between two countries. And the sorts of things that theoretically and what we know in practice drive exports are things like income growth, distance to market, the size of the market, exchange rates, tariffs, non-tariff measures, whole range of things. All of these things combined help to determine how much a country should, in theory, export to another country. So we're going to build a model that tells us what expected exports should be given what we know about conditions in these markets. If we find that there's a gap between expected and observed, then that's a real indication that there are some policy measures in our overseas markets that are starting to distort the market beyond what we would normally expect. And I hope that is going to provide you the insights you need to go on and talk further to officials and ministers about what we might do about it. I wouldn't be an economist if there wasn't one equation in the presentation. So there will be a test on this later. The model that we're going to use is something called a gravity model. It's a very common model used in trade policy analysis, and it's inspired and named after Sir Isaac Newton, who said that the gravitational force between two objects is proportional to the size of the objects and the distance between them. And that's essentially what a gravity model does. It explains exports based on GDP, which is a measure of size of an economy, a series of trade frictions, and that includes distance, tariffs, non-tariff measures that we can identify, whether or not that country is a member of a free trade agreement, a whole range of things like that, and costs and prices, which refers often to exchange rates. So we try and explain exports by all of these factors, and then we'll compare that to actual trade flows to see if there's a big gap. If there's a big gap, there's something we need to investigate further. It suggests that the market could be distorted by something that's not in our model. So we can do this by each individual market that you export to, and it will be done over time. It's a whole lot of number crunching. Thankfully, son of Muldoon is a very, very good number cruncher, so I won't have to be doing that. And I don't envy his task. It's pretty tough technically. As I say, we haven't quite finalised the contract with MFAT, but just sort of manage expectations. This is going to be a fairly technical report. It's a whole lot of number crunching and trying to explain what the numbers tell us. We're going to torture it until it screams. We're not then going to go into the what could you do about it if we identify certain trade distortions. That is really a conversation that can be had between your association's members and leaders and officials and ministers. It may be domestic policy issues you want to tweak. It may be looking more at international options. We're not going to do detailed country-by-country analysis, trying to get deep into exactly what's causing what. We're going to let the numbers speak for themselves, explain as much as we can, but given the nature of this exercise, we may not be able to point our fingers exactly at what trade measures are causing these distortions. And we won't be really talking about New Zealand's regulatory settings and whether or not they are sufficiently supportive of manufacturing and wood processing. So that's all I had for you. I'm very happy to take questions now. We can talk more about econometrics and equations if you like. I suspect not. But if you do have any questions about the scope of what we're trying to do and what we might find, I'm very happy to take them now, or you can catch me at any stage during the day.